Hi, this is Scott Garibay, and today we're going to talk about the OR report. What is the OR report? The OR report is the report done by the OR group, ORR. Who is the OR group? Well, the OR group is the people who maintain Roll20. Roll20 is the number one virtual tabletop used as an online tool to play pretty much any and all tabletop role-playing games that you would desire to play on Roll20. Okay, now Roll20 is really important. It's a very powerful platform. It has official connections with Wizards of the Coast for playing Dungeons and Dragons, and it has official connections with a few other tabletop role-playing game companies to officially play, right? And then it also is a general online tool set to allow you to play tabletop role-playing games of other things. Well, now what is in the OR report? Well, the OR report is really fascinating. Specifically, the OR report is reporting what percentage of tabletop role-playing games are being played on Roll20, right? And it is pretty incredible. The report is very, very fascinating. All right, so let's talk about it. All right, so what's the most shocking fact that comes out of the OR report? Well, it's Dungeons & Dragons 5e. Guess how much Dungeons & Dragons 5e play comprises, percentage-wise, of all the games on Roll20? 51%. That means that Dungeons & Dragons 5th edition, more people play Dungeons & Dragons 5th edition on Roll20 than all other games combined, right? That is incredible. Right, is really incredible. What about what about other games? What are other games that have significant play numbers on Roll20? Right. Well, the biggest ones are pretty shocking as well. Call of Cthulhu has 9%. 9%. That is the number one tabletop role-playing game played on Roll20. That is not Dungeons & Dragons, right? All right. Additionally, Pathfinder 1, not Pathfinder 2, Pathfinder 1 has 6% of all games played on Roll20 are that, right? Are 6% of all games played on Roll20 are Pathfinder games. There is a grouping of a number of games that all have less than 2%, but were large enough to actually get listed, right? Because many of the games have so few games that they weren't even listed within the report. All the games, those games are lumped together, and they're under uncategorized, which is 14%. But all of the following games are listed, actually have 2% or more. So Dungeons & Dragons 3e is one of those games. Shadowrun is one of those games. Star Wars is one of those games. World of Darkness is one of those games. Starfinder is one of those games. And those are all the games. Oh, and actually Warhammer as well. So Warhammer also had Warhammer Fantasy, right? So that is all of the games that had 2% or less, but were large enough to be listed distinctly. Now that's pretty incredible. Like, what does all that mean? Like, what do those numbers? What kind of analysis can we bring out of those numbers? Well, one, Dungeons & Dragons remains absolutely huge, right? So Dungeons & Dragons 5e has more people are playing that than all other tabletop role-playing games combined, right? In addition to that, 3e comes in at that 2%, little below 2% mark, right? The other thing that's really interesting about Dungeons & Dragons is the only editions that really get play on, at the macro level on Roll20 are 5e and 3e. 4e I think is a hard reject, just like it was when it was actually out and when it was live between 2008 and 2014, and it's still being rejected today on Roll20. And then 1e and 2e are just the most niche, hipster, grognard. They just don't matter, right? Like, they're not being played in significant numbers, right? And and I think that's become even more apparent because of OSR, right? The people who want to play 1e and 2e There's a ton of really good hacks now. The white hack, the black hack, index card RPG, Tiny D6. Questing Beast is just an incredible resource for OSR games. He catalogs a whole bunch of really, really good OSR games. Maze Rats is another incredible OSR game. But like, if you want to play 1E or 2E, there's just so many better ways to do it now, and so that's pretty big. The other thing I think is really interesting is intellectual property, right? So, out of all the games that are listed within the OR group, within the OR report, only 2 of them come from intellectual properties, right? One of them, distinct intellectual properties that did not start as role-playing games, okay? Now, like Shadowrun is an intellectual property right now, but that game was built for a role-playing game. It's a role-playing game world, right? So is Warhammer, right? That war, nobody converted Warhammer. Warhammer was built from the ground up to be a role-playing game intellectual property, right? So to be a role-playing game, period, right? And the intellectual property it's a symptom. It's a symptom of another activity, right? But what are the 2 intellectual properties that existed prior to the games, and then these games have made these strong enough to actually gain some actual real numbers on Roll20? Well, the first one is Call of Cthulhu. It's incredible that Call of Cthulhu has 9%. It's the second largest game played on Roll20. That's incredible. Now, why is that? Well, Call of Cthulhu is really unique. It is a strong intellectual property in the horror genre, right? But even more than that, Call of Cthulhu has become a very special, unique property within tabletop role-playing games because H.P. Lovecraft was a very talented writer, and he gained people know what it is, right? When you say Call of Cthulhu, when you say Cthulhu, people know what it is beyond tabletop role-playing games, right? So why, so it's really quite fascinating. So basically, the reason why Call of Cthulhu has done so well is it is an intellectual property, but it is in the public domain, which means that people can just jump right on and create whatever kind of games they want. Now, ICE specifically has Crown Games. They've made their bones making Call of Cthulhu, but anybody can jump in and make a Call of Cthulhu game, and many people have, right? So I think that's one of the reasons why Call of Cthulhu is out there. Call of Cthulhu, by the way, is on its 7th edition. 7th edition. That's a lot of editions, right? Like, that's pretty incredible, right? With their game being far younger, well, probably 10 years younger than Dungeons and Dragons, right? So that's incredible, right? So Call of Cthulhu is really significant. Then the other one is Star Wars. Star Wars, now it doesn't even come in at 9%. It comes in at 2%, right? So Star Wars comes in at 2%. But I think one of the reasons why Star Wars is there is, one, it is an incredibly powerful intellectual property. And this cannot be understated. It is incredible that Star Wars is still a licensed property for tabletop role-playing games, right? And the reason why is just let's be super clear here. Marvel is not, okay? Marvel is no longer available to purchase as a tabletop role-playing game. There is no current license for Marvel tabletop role-playing games, and it's super sad because Margaret Weis was the last. Margaret Weis Weis's tabletop role-playing game company was the last company to have the Marvel tabletop role-playing game license and be able to actually sell it. It was an amazing game. I absolutely loved it. I own those books, and I'm incredibly fortunate. I actually own the Marvel Saga game with the cards. That game is worth a fortune now. I feel very, very fortunate to own an original copy. And then, and I will admit to you, I very rarely play it because I'm so concerned about ruining the physical copy. It's the first game I've really had an issue with that, where the value of the game has become so high, it really does serve as an obstacle to me playing the game. That's the only game I own that really falls into that bracket. That's kind of incredible in itself. But and then Margaret Weis's game was an incredibly good game, but it was incredibly non-intuitive, and many people just did not understand how to play it, which was really super sad because people were confused by the last iteration of a legal Marvel tabletop role-playing game license, right? And so Marvel is now owned by Disney, and they're like, heck to the no, nobody's touching this. We're not giving anybody permission to tell stories legally with our characters, right? And it really shocks me that Star Wars is still able to do this. Now, one of the reasons why Star Wars is still available as an intellectual property is because Fantasy Flight Games is so professional with that, has done such an incredible job with Star Wars as a tabletop role-playing game. Their books are amazing. The art is incredible. The production quality is incredible. And it literally innovated the tabletop role-playing game industry, and the narrative dice used for Star Wars are one of the truest, most specific, and most wonderful innovations ever created in tabletop role-playing games, right? So Fantasy Flight Games has done an incredible job to continue to move forward on Star Wars. So it really is quite amazing what has happened with with these games, and the only two intellectual properties that have enough numbers to actually get listed on the OR report are Star Wars and are Call of Cthulhu, right? Really, really interesting. The OR report is pretty incredible. One thing, just a couple more notes that I'm thinking about with overall, that I've been thinking about with the OR report is one. This is really important, but in order to understand Dungeons & Dragons, you really need to understand Dungeons & Dragons in the following way. Dungeons & Dragons is really... What is Dungeons & Dragons? Well, Dungeons & Dragons is the planet that all other tabletop role-playing games... is the planet that all other tabletop role-playing games orbit, right? They're all within, low Earth. All tabletop role-playing games are in low Earth orbit around Dungeons & Dragons. And so Dungeons & Dragons is so powerful, right? And its property is so powerful and so significant that games have a very, very hard time escaping the orbit of these properties, right? And it's a very significant thing to realize that all of these games are simply orbiting that, Dungeons & Dragons overall. So that's everything I wanted to share with you today about the OR report. Let me know your thoughts. Please consider liking and subscribing, and have a wonderful millennium.